You can see the song. Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the last public program of the 2024-2025 academic year here at Rutgers. I'm Nancy Simkoff. I'm the academic director of the Allen and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life and professor of Jewish Studies and History at Rutgers. I've been here for about 27, 28 years. It is my absolute pleasure to see you here on this beautiful evening. Looking out, we see spring has sprung. It's very, very hopeful, which I think we all could use. Tonight's talk is a conversation, but it's based on a new book by my colleague and friend, Professor Claudia Setzer, The Progressive's Bible, How Scriptural Interpretation Built a More Just America. The format is that Professor Setzer is going to speak for about 20-25 minutes, and then she'll be joined in this nice setting, kind of late night talk show thing here we have going on with Professor Gary Rendsburg, my colleague in the Department of Jewish Studies and History. So let me introduce Professor Setzer. I'll also introduce Professor Rendsburg so that I won't have to interrupt later. Claudia Setzer is a professor of religious studies emerita at Manhattan University. She is a New Testament scholar with a focus on early Jewish-Christian relations, the development of belief in resurrection, feminist interpretation of scripture, and the Bible in American culture. In addition to the book that she's talking about today, The Progressive's Bible, her books include The Bible and the American Experience, which she co-authored with David Shefferman, The Bible and American Culture, a source book co-authored also with David Shefferman, and Resurrection of the Body in Early Judaism and Early Christianity, which our visiting scholar Jenny Lebanks, who writes on early rabbinics, is very happy about. Professor Gary Rendsburg, many of you know him. He's been a feature and a fixture here at Rutgers for about 20 years, I think I got that right. He is the Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies and History and holds the Blanche Irving Laureate Chair in Jewish History at Rutgers. His teaching and research span the gamut of ancient and medieval Jewish history and culture, including Bible, ancient Israel, ancient Egypt, Hebrew language, Semitic languages, Dead Sea Scrolls, and medieval manuscripts, Hebrew manuscript. He is a passionate Hebraist in all forms and the author of 8 books, including How the Bible is Written, Solomon's Vineyard, Literary and Linguistic Studies in the Song of Songs, Hebrew in the Book of Kings, the JPS Bible Commentary, 1 Samuel. So you're in for a real treat. 2 heady intellectuals who care a lot about the Bible. Please welcome Professor Claudia Setzer.
My thanks to the Bildner Center for this gracious invitation, to Nancy Simkoff, Karen Small, and Robert Auerbach, and especially to Gary Rendsburg, who read the whole book. And to all of you who've come out to hear us. Like many people, I watched the speeches of Martin Luther King as a teenager. I took for granted his references to the mountaintop, the valleys being exalted, and justice flowing down like water, not thinking much about their biblical provenance. But some years ago, I read a book called A Stone of Hope by David Chappell, who credits much of the strength and endurance of the civil rights activists to their immersion in biblical and prophetic values. They inhabited a different reality. I began to think about how the Bible functioned in American history and American sense of themselves. The Hebrew Bible figures prominently because it's on a national scale. It's the story of a people. Many groups saw themselves as Israel. The Puritans on an errand into the wilderness, 19th century Mormons, enslaved people who viewed America as a new Egypt. What sparked my desire to write a book was the question of how various reform movements activated the biblical text. Abolition of slavery, 19th century women's rights activism is part of the movement, not all, temperance, and the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. We all know the Bible has been marshaled by groups on the wrong side of history, say to support slavery or to deny women's equality. But we need to appreciate that progressives used it too. We'll look at two interpreters, and then I will mention some contemporary movements. What I want us to think about is why use the Bible at all? The first movement is for the abolition of slavery, prominent in 19th century America. Abolitionists had a number of methods, but I'll emphasize two. They argued that slavery was a sin, and they employed the Jeremiah, an intense prophetic critique. Enslavement is a sin that violates God's laws. It's kidnapping, forbidden in Exodus 21, for which the penalty is death. It's also, they told us, against two of the 10 commandments. Thou shalt not steal and thou shalt not covet. As enslavement covets and takes another's right to determine their own life. Also, the law in Deuteronomy 23:15 forbids returning a runaway enslaved person. The other method is the Jeremiah, after the prophet Jeremiah, which I like to call prophecy on steroids. In it, the prophet indicts the nation for its sins and threatens them. Now, prophets often start out nice. You have an idyllic image of a vineyard, a basket of summer fruit, and then they bring down the hammer. God's gonna lay waste your vineyard. Your fruit's gonna rot, and God's gonna send other nations to destroy you. With some prophets, there's a glimmer of hope at the end, if you reform your ways. This method was used in the abolitionist and civil rights movements. Dr. King was a master of it. His last speech, for which we only have the title, was Why America May Go to Hell. A prime example of the Jeremiah is the famous speech by the abolitionist Frederick Douglass, popularly known as What to a Slave is the 4th of July. He was formerly enslaved himself and first learned to read when his mistress read the Bible to him and began teaching him to read it. The lesson stopped when her husband said reading, quote, would unfit him to be a slave, unquote. From that moment, Douglass knew that literacy and knowledge was the path to freedom. So let's look at a few nuggets from a very long speech in 1 second. It was delivered in 1852, 2 years after the Fugitive Slave Law was put in place. A law that an enslaved person, even if they made it to a free state, must be returned to the enslaver. The Civil War is still nearly a decade away. This, of course, is a direct violation of Deuteronomy 23:15, quote, you shall not return to their owners' slaves who have escaped to you. They shall reside with you in your midst, in any place they choose, in any one of your towns, wherever they please. You shall not oppress them, unquote. Well, whom does he rail against? I cut this out, but first the judges and civil authorities who enforce the law, but even more so, the churches and the ministers who fail to protest slavery. Now, he's not anti-Christian, far from it, but, let me read. The churches and ministers, have taught that a man may properly be a slave, that the relation of master and slave is ordained of God, that to send back an escaped bondman to his master is clearly the duty of the followers of the Lord Jesus Christ. And this horrible blasphemy is palmed off upon the world for Christianity. As I said, he was hardly anti-Christian, he was actually ordained to preach, but he often spoke of two kinds of Christianity. One of love, that cares for the widow and orphan, binds up the wounds of the fallen, and the other, the slave-holding, woman-whipping, mind-darkening one, practiced in the South. He loves the first and hates the second. To continue, for my part, I would say welcome infidelity, welcome atheism, welcome anything in preference to the gospel as preached by those divines. In the language of Isaiah, the American church would be well addressed. Bring no more vain oblations. Incense is an abomination to me. The new moons and Sabbaths, the calling the assemblies, I cannot away with it. It's iniquity. Even the solemn meeting, your new moons and your appointed feasts, my soul hateth. They were trouble to me, I'm weary to bear this. And when you spread your hands, I will hide mine eyes from you. Yea, when you make many prayers, I will not hear. Your hands are full of blood. Cease to do evil, learn to do well, seek judgment, relieve the oppressed, judge for the fatherless, plead for the widow. The American church is guilty. There is no power out of the church that could sustain slavery an hour if it were not sustained in it. The material in italics, I'm sure some of you must recognize. It's from Isaiah 1:14-17. This is a classic theme of the prophets, that God, who's speaking, is saying he rejects empty ritual if it's not accompanied by social justice. If the ministers and religious press condemned slavery, moreover, Douglas said it would disappear in a day. He said it would crumble and scatter to the winds. In the next excerpt, he refers to American sympathy for the many failed European revolutions and other uprisings of his time. He charges hypocrisy, the most pungent charge of the prophets. Americans, your Republican politics, not less than your Republican religion, are flagrantly inconsistent. You are all on fire at the mention of liberty for France or for Ireland, or as cold as an iceberg at the thought of liberty for the enslaved of America. Discourse eloquently on the dignity of labor, yet wring the last hard-earned farthing from the grasp of the black laborers of your country. You profess to believe that God, one blood, God made all nations of men to dwell on the face of the earth and had commanded all men everywhere to love one another. Yet you notoriously hate and glory in your hatred all men whose skins are not colored like your own. Slavery destroys your moral power abroad, and it corrupts your politicians at home. It saps the foundation of religion. It makes your name a hissing and a byword to a mocking earth. This is actually the slimmed down version of Douglas. He is much more expansive, but anyway, you see his power. So notice he cites a verse first from the New Testament, from Acts 17, God has made of one blood all nations, in the King James Version, and these are all going to be from the King James. And this shows the equality of all people. Why? Because they're all descended from Adam. They're all of one blood. There's also a claim that the nation is a hissing and a byword, or a hissing and a reproach. And that is from Jeremiah 29:18, when the prophet says, people who strayed from God will be disgraced and mocked among the nations. And we see this expression, a hissing and a reproach, frequently in abolitionist argument, that slavery shames the whole country, staining both the enslaved and the enslavers. The next one, we don't actually have to read it, the one at the top, but let me just mention that he used this striking image of slavery as a venomous snake, an ant, nursing at the breast of a youthful republic. He's taking a familiar ideal of the image of the Messianic age from Isaiah 11:8. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid, the suckling child shall play over the hole of the ass, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the adder's den. In other words, everything will be so peaceful in this ideal Messianic time that toddlers will play safely near poisonous snakes. Let me just read it, it's so amazing. Yet he turns it on its head. He says it's really a horrible reptile that's coiled up in your nation's bosom, nursing at the breasts of the youthful republic. It's really quite horrifying. So he takes it and turns it upside down. And the other thing to mention is you'll see that he talks about, at the very last line, the Constitution as being on his side. Now, not everybody agreed with him on that, but he takes the founding documents of the country, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and he uses them really as other sacred texts that promote liberty. Not everyone agreed with him. Some thought the Constitution was pro-slavery, but he did think he was on his side. Dr. King does the same thing with the founding documents, treats them as sacred texts. You may remember him saying, somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Finally, like most prophets, he brings you nearly to despair. But then he gives you some hope. This is the second excerpt. Allow me to say in conclusion, notwithstanding the dark picture I this day presented of the state of the nation, I do not despair of this country. There are forces in operation which must inevitably work the downfall of slavery. The arm of the Lord is not shortened. And I therefore leave off where I began, with hope. While drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence, the great principles it contains, and the genius of American institutions, my spirit is also cheered by the obvious tendencies of this age. The fact that he could say this when slavery is still ascendant in 1852, I find somewhat inspiring and hopeful for some of us who are a little discouraged these days. The next person I want to look at is Fannie Lou Hamer, a leader in the civil rights movement. Now, I do give a lot of space to Dr. King in my book, but I wanted to foreground some of the women who did the day-to-day work of the civil rights movement and got less notice than the flamboyant veiled pictures. Hamer had a very limited formal schooling and grew up in a family of poor sharecroppers. She was a riveting speaker, known for her plain spokenness. Her famous line was, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." She spoke at the Democratic Party convention in 1964, trying to replace the official segregationist party. There were multiple attempts on her life. She was badly beaten in a Mississippi jail, and you'll see what she told the policeman there. This is from her earliest public speech from a voter registration rally in Greenwood, Mississippi in 1963. There's a sort of canon within a canon in the movement. There are many verses that are said over and over again and become as familiar as the opening chords of a rock song. And the audience hears them and they go crazy, saying, yeah, they're gonna play Born to Run, whatever. They know what's coming. One of the constantly used verses is at the top here. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captive, recovering sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are bruised. Now this is from the Gospel of Luke. As Jesus begins his ministry, he goes to the synagogue and is asked to read from the prophets. So he picks up the scroll and he reads this, which is a combination of Isaiah 58:6, which we Jews read on Yom Kippur, and Isaiah 61, 1-2. Luke's point is that Jesus is now taking up the prophet's mantle and will carry on his task. Hamer implies that she is now the one delivering God's message. And we see this verse, the Spirit of the Lord, all over African American interpretation. Dr. King says it too. I have to say, when Cory Booker gave his marathon speech, I couldn't help but think that he too was in this tradition. Second paragraph there, now the time had come. That was Christ's purpose on earth. Well, we only been getting by paying our way to hell. But the time is out. When Simon Cyrene was helping Christ to bear his cross up the hill, he said, must Jesus bear this cross alone and all the world go free? He said, no, there's a cross for everyone, and there's a cross for me. And it's no easy way out. We just got to wake up and face it, folks. And if I can face the issue, you can too. But you see, it's poison. It's poison for us not to speak what we know is right. As Christ said in the 17th chapter of Acts, the 26th verse, he said, has made of one blood all nations for to dwell on the face of the earth. And it's no different. We just had different colors. And brother, you can believe this or not, I've been sick of this system as long as I can remember. I heard some people speak of depression in the 20s, in the 30s. In the 20s, it was depression with me, depression. I've been as hungry. It's a funny thing since I started working for Christ. It's kind of like in the 23rd Psalms when he says, thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Thou anointed my head with oil and my cup runneth over. And I have walked through the shadows of death, because it was on the 10th of September in 62 when they shot 16 times in a house, and it wasn't a foot over where my head was. But that night I wasn't there. Don't you see what God can do? So you see, there's the Spirit of the Lord idea. There's also her identification with the African construct, Chinese in North Africa, the African conscript who carried Jesus' cross. There's the verse about God making one blood of all nations, and the 23rd Psalm, all naturally fused with her own experience. Her speech is chock full of biblical verses, which she weaves together, I think, more tightly than Douglas. But she's talking about their own experiences in the movement for African Americans fighting to vote. And I've asked God, I said, now Lord, and you have to, ain't no need to lie and say you ain't. Said, open a way for us. Said, please make a way for us, Jesus. Said, when I can stand up and speak for my race and speak for these hungry children. And he opened a way and all that mostly back out. You see, he made it so plain for us. He sent a man in Mississippi with the same name that Moses had to go to Egypt and tell him to go down to Mississippi and tell Ross Barnett to let my people go. And you know, I feel good. I feel good. I never know today it was going to happen tonight, but I do know as I walk along, I walk with my hand in God's hand. And you see, you know the ballot is good. If it wasn't good, how come he's trying to keep you from it? He's still using it. Don't be foolish, folks. They going in there by droves and droves, and they had guards to keep us out the other day, and dogs. Now, if that's good enough for them, I want some of it too. So open a way for us in Isaiah 43:19-21. Quote, I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert to give drink to my people, my chosen, unquote. So this notion of opening a way, there's an expression in African American interpretation to make a way out of no way. I always love that. And I think that and Herbert is loosely linked to that sometimes you see there's no way to go, but God will open a way in the wilderness. Who is Moses? Well, there's biblical Moses, clearly, but there's also Bob Moses, who was a civil rights organizer in Mississippi. But note she says, it's the same thing. It's like the same name. It's God acting in history again. Ross Barnett, of course, was the segregationist governor of Mississippi, who had activists beaten and put in jail. And finally, the third section, where the verses come fast and furious. You can count them. Then on the 9th of June this year, I was beaten in a jailhouse until I was hard as metal. And I told the policeman, I said, it's going to be miserable when you have to face God, I said, because one day you're going to have to pay up for the things you have done. I said, because as the scripture says, has made of one blood all nations. He said, it's a damn lie. He said, Abraham Lincoln said that. Well, that's pitiful. I'm telling you the truth, but it's pitiful, you see, that people can have so much hate that will make them beat a person and don't know they're doing wrong. But open your New Testament when you get home and read from the 26th chapter of Proverbs and the 27th verse. Whoso diggeth a pit shall fall down in it. Pits have been dug for us for ages, but they didn't know when they was digging pits for us, they had some pits dug for themselves. And the Bible had said, before one jot of my word would fail, heaven and earth would pass away. Be not deceived, for God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. Well, there's the one blood verse again, and then Proverbs, which is obviously from the Hebrew Bible, not the New Testament. He who digs a pit will fall in it, whatever you do will come back to you. And then from the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, till heaven and earth pass away, not one jot or tittle will pass from the law. This is where Jesus says that he has come to fulfill the Torah, not to abolish it. She's got that there. And God is not mocked, and whatsoever a man sows, that is from Paul's letter to the Galatians. Now, how is she using the biblical text? I think she's a bit different from Douglas. She does proof texting, right? She drags verses right and left to affirm what she's saying. In some ways, I think she's more granular. She kind of drills down into the text and brings up these nuggets of gold. Second, she fuses her own experience with the biblical story, and Douglas did that too, but she really does that. This is not just about some events in Mississippi. They are part of this grand apocalyptic drama playing out in history, a battle between God and Satan. It's a battle to the death in an imitation of Christ and another martyr, the Apostle Paul. She creates, finally, a counter-narrative. There's a sense that civil rights activists inhabit a destiny. It's subversive. People in power like Ross Barnett are only temporary, and they will be defeated and the righteous will flourish. This is a feature of apocalyptic thought, which is very common in the New Testament and at least certain parts of the Hebrew Bible. Finally, what about contemporary social justice movements? I originally, when I wrote this book, thought I would end with a short chapter explaining, well, why we don't really see much of this deep engagement with the biblical text anymore, and why is that? Wrong. Dead wrong. In fact, it became an exercise in paring down examples to fit into one chapter. And in the interest of time, I'll just list them. The Me Too movement, founder Tarana Burke, and women who have both critiqued and drawn strength from biblical texts to confront the prevalence of sexual assault. Repairers of the Breach, a broad movement founded by Reverend William Barber II that builds on the earlier civil rights movement and calls for a third reconstruction. Shareholder activists, especially from Catholic religious orders, who invest their pension funds in companies and demand corporate responsibility. The Dominican Adrian Sisters of Caldwell, New Jersey were one of the first groups to do this. For Jewish advocacy, I mentioned the climate activist group Dayenu, whose founder, Rabbi Jenny Rosen, has this wonderful video, Speak Torah to Power, which is filled with biblical ideas like Shomer Adamah, keeping the earth, the Jubilee, letting the land rest, the idea that the earth belongs to God. She helps answer the question, I think, why use the Bible in religious tradition? The book also looks at Rabbi Jill Jacobs, who heads Truah, and her book, There Shall Be No Needy Among You. It's an extended reflection on Deuteronomy 15, which fuels her notion of economic justice and Jewish responsibility. Well, let me just pause for a moment and return to my first question, why use the Bible at all? Why not just principles of human rights? And I have my own answers to this, which I think we'll get to, but I'd like to stop for now and give Gary Rendsburg and other people a chance to talk. Thank you.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Here's the book, not just an image on the screen, but this wonderful book by Claudia Setzer, The Progressive Bible, A Scriptural Interpretation Built a More Just America. And I just want to say a few comments, and then I'm going to start asking Claudia some specific questions. There are 4 individuals in the book whose names I knew and whose stories are well known to almost all Americans. You heard 2 of them already this evening, from Claudia, Frederick Douglass, and Martin Luther King. And then in the chapter on the women's movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. But the gem of this book are the individuals totally unknown to me, and probably totally unknown to most people in this room, who were side by side with the more famous names that we've just mentioned. And I just want to, begin as just to reiterate what Claudia said. There are 4 chapters, one on abolitionism, one on women's rights, one on the temperance movement, and then bringing it up to the more recent past, the civil rights movement. And I just, need to ask you, how did you find these people? I'm going to start with page 2 on the first chapter on abolitionism. So we heard Claudia's comments about Frederick Douglass, well known. Maria Stewart, right? No one's ever heard of Maria Stewart, correct? Freeborn African-American woman who did so much in the abolitionist movement, including, as we learn in this book, quoting from the Bible. So how did you find these people? I'll just start with Maria Stewart for one.
That's a very good question. She has been written, there's been a whole group within the Society of Biblical Literature that it has a kind of a funny title called Recovering Women Interpreters of Scripture. It's like you're trying to, 12-step program for women who interpret Scripture, but they have called all kinds of literature about all kinds of women who were interpreting the Bible throughout the ages. And what's interesting about Maria Stewart is that she didn't preach for very long, but she was out there before Sojourner Truth, before Frederick Douglass, and maybe that's the problem. She didn't get enough press. So she was very short-lived in her career. She was around Boston. But she's had her book, Religion and the Pure Principles of Morality, which was this very intense abolitionist text.
I'm
Want to hear about anybody else?
No, I mean, just wonderful that these were eye-openers to me, and I certainly encourage everyone who has the interest to read the book, because you're going to learn about all sorts of people, which brings me to the next couple. We're still in the abolitionist chapter. So the husband and wife team of Angelina Grimke Weld and her husband Theodore Dwight Weld, the two of them, she was clearly the more vocal, these major abolitionists of the 19th century. And they were white Southerners who had witnessed the treatment of slaves in the South. And again, just how wonderful, and pointed out that the slavery that they knew in the South and they witnessed was nothing like the slavery that you see in the Bible, and pointing this out over and over again. Slavery exists in the Bible, but you have to be kind to slaves, you have to return runaway slaves, and the kind of abuse of slaves that they witnessed. So again, I'll just ask you about the Welds and how they just came to you through the same process of learning about these.
I guess if you read a lot, Theodore Weld was fairly well known, I think, and he's sort of the classic white New England minister that at least I used to think of when I was an abolitionist. In fact, there were many African Americans in the abolitionist movement. Angelina Grimke and her sister Sarah were both abolitionists. They were, I think, the earliest women to work for the Abolitionist Society. They would go around the country speaking to what they called promiscuous assemblies, meaning mixed men and women. So they were unique in that respect. Also, the Welds, the three of them, the two sisters and Theodore, put together a document called American Slavery as It Is. And it was one of the more influential documents. It gathered all the objective references to what was really happening under slavery, and then used reports from slave owners. They used newspaper accounts, letters, even handbills advertising runaway slaves that would refer to missing an ear or a scar, that would testify to what had happened to these slaves. You can read it, it's online, it's been digitized. It is the most horrific reading you can imagine. I mean, I thought I knew about slavery, but some of the things that they describe are it's just beyond belief that humans could do this to each other. So they were actually, that was quite a powerful document that was out there circulating century. It's somewhat after Uncle Thomas Cabot, which I guess is the most influential.
So Claudia wants to know the audience to whom she's speaking, that she mentioned both New Jersey Senator Cory Booker and then the convent in Caldwell, New Jersey as well. So I just have to add the coda, which is actually quite sad, but keep it in New Jersey. Quoting from the book, by 1843, the Grimkes, the sisters, and Weld, the husband of Angelina, by 1843, still 2 decades before the Civil War, how sad is this? They were somewhat disillusioned and concentrating on raising their family and running their farm in Belleville, New Jersey, which today is very urban, part of Essex County. So they made the work and they just retreated, receded.
I think their health suffered. I know he kind of lost his voice. He had also gone around to the American Abolition Society preaching. He kind of lost his voice. unfortunate problems with childbirth. So there was some health problems, but her sister, Sarah, older sister, she, I think, continued. She was very important in feminism. She wrote some of the earliest letters defending women's equality from the Bible. She's in the book
And
too.
appears in the second chapter, right?
So, yeah, it's quite a family.
I want to just point of information. I'm co-teaching a course this semester entitled The English Bible, and several of our students are here, and we're focusing on the King James Bible. And as Claudia said, and as she says in the introduction to the book, so I'm directing my comments to my students in particular, it's a good reminder that in the 19th century, the King James Bible is 1611. But in the 19th century, English readers, both in Britain and America, are still using the King James Bible. So you're quoting this living document, as it were, 2.5 centuries, let's say, in some cases 3 centuries. So this is a fine point to remember. Most of us today use more modern English translations when we read the Bible. But that was, I thought, a key point. It really rang for me, and now rings for my students when they get to hear that. So you spent some time talking about the curse of Ham. So a little background information. In the book of Genesis, Noah has 3 sons, and because he's the first one to plant a vineyard, nothing to do with the chapter on temperance, by the way, he himself gets inebriated, and his son Ham sees him naked. And the other 2 brothers, the other 2 sons, come in and cover their father Noah respectfully, actually by walking backwards, holding a cloth and covering him so they don't, in his inebriation, he can apparently become naked, so that they pay honor to their father. And when Noah awakes, he curses Ham. And Ham is associated with the peoples of Africa. And so I was taken, the argument that Weld made is that the curse of Ham was for a single person, just for that son. But this pro-slavery people were using that, did I understand that correctly, as a curse of the entire, what they would have called race of Africans.
Yeah, it shows how irrational it all was, because it was this pretty goofy story, I think, in the Bible, and it was his son, it was the son of Canaan, isn't he associated in the next chapter with the Table of Nations with peoples of Africa, and so, oh, see, all African people should be enslaved. I mean, it's just, it's bizarre, it's a bizarre story to start with, and to make that conclusion, you know, but clearly people are motivated, they want to prove something, and they find a Bible verse, but it was quite prevalent.
So take us back to 19th century America, because a number of times you made a comment here that Frederick Douglass did not do proof texting in the way that Fannie Lou Hamer did 100 years later, but he certainly uses the Bible. You mentioned Psalm 137, you mentioned Amos 8. So Psalm 137 is the well-known psalm of the Jews in Babylonian exile by the rivers of Babylon, etc. And that Douglass saw the African slavery experience in America as their exile, so that was parallel. Maybe that poem is well known, that song. But then he also quotes Amos chapter 8 as a parallel to corrupt religious practices and so on. So to what extent would an audience listening to Douglass, he was an orator, most of these were orations, to what extent would the audience know the Bible that well, to know something like Amos 8?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I guess I do assume that speech was given to the Ladies Abolitionist Society in Rochester. I guess I have an image of the Bible being more prevalent. It was certainly part of the Victorian home, and this big Bible in the parlor. But did people read it as much? I don't know. And I don't know how we find that out. But the other thing is, I think sometimes things sound biblical, and maybe you can't tell me exactly where it's from or something, but you know that's a biblical thing that they're saying, and that's good enough. And Dr. King as well. I mean, just to slow down like water, that was one of his favorite verses.
Book of Amos.
Amos. Did everybody know that's where it's from? No. But
didn't matter, it was still a powerful image, so I would love to be able to do that. Oh, one more thing. The Bible was in a lot of secular newspapers too, it was kind of all over the place. There's a new website by someone named Lincoln Mullen that gathers all these 19th and early 20th century secular newspapers and shows places where they quote the Bible. So it was maybe a little bit more in the fabric of the culture. But yeah, I would love to be able to answer that better, but that's the best I can do.
Another part of the, staying with the first chapter on abolitionism, another point that you made, as people on both sides, I guess, of the debate in 19th century America pointed out, is that Jesus says a lot of things about a lot of subjects, but never says a word about slavery. You mentioned that a couple of times. Can you say a little bit about how both sides used the lack of any comment to their opinion?
Well, both slavery and women's rights, I think it's fair to say that Jesus didn't say enough and Paul said too much. You know, well, for the women's rights and the anti-slavery people said, well, of course Jesus is on our side with his general teaching on love for neighbor, love and acceptance. Of course he couldn't condone slavery. Of course he couldn't. Of course women around him, whom he treated well, of course he was in favor of women's rights. There was just kind of an assumption. Although, to back up that first statement a little bit, he does have parables attributed to him that assume friendly servants and slaves, but nobody seems to worry about that. The pro-slavery people, everyone's very inventive. They somehow, someone quoted the golden rule, do unto others, do unto you. As being pro-slavery. I mean, I don't know how, but they somehow twisted it in that way. Yeah. In a way, when somebody doesn't say anything, you can say whatever you want about them.
Well, I'll have to remember your quote about Jesus, Paul saying too much about both. That's wonderful. As we move to the chapter on women's rights in the 19th century, I mentioned Susan B. Anthony, third female who's mentioned in that chapter, actually on the first page, is another eye-opener to me, is a woman named Lucy Stone. Now, Rutgers people, I'm looking at Stanley and others, will know that there's a Lucy Stone Hall on our Livingston campus. And I don't think it ever occurred to me to look up and say, who was Lucy Stone? I just assumed, like most Rutgers buildings, probably named from some donor from some time ago. But it turns out, no, Lucy Stone was a 19th century campaigner for women's rights alongside her two more famous contemporaries. I don't know how many American college campuses have a Lucy Stone Hall, but I'm now proud to be associated with one of the universities that does. And that's remarkable. I shared this with Claudia. She would have had no knowledge of the fact that we have a Lucy Stone Hall. As many of you know, Livingston campus, founded at Livingston College in the 1970s, was part of the movement in America in the 60s and 70s to create a more liberal environment, which was almost counterculture, if I can use that expression. And clearly, the founders of that college / campus was Lucy Stone as I don't think she had a New Jersey connection.
No, I don't know. She was quite educated. She,
we have a yellow jacket or something on the stage. A biblical plague has struck.
Like, I'm pretty sure, right, she went to Oberlin to learn biblical languages because she was troubled by that whole verse in Genesis that a woman's husband shall rule over her. Yeah, is that right? She went to her mother, that can't be it. She went to Oberlin to learn languages. She had no use for the Bible. She really said it was part of this great institutional wall that prevented women's equality. Yeah.
Speaking of women's and the Bible, and this I knew about, but I didn't know enough about it. It's in contrast to something which I'll just mention in a moment. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton actually edited a woman's Bible, which is included in Claudia's chapter, and proposed a conference to bring people together, which would have included Jews and Catholics. And this was not common in 19th century America, where obviously the majority of culture was Protestant, and Jews and Catholics were somewhat on the social margins. Say a little bit more part of something that I certainly learned, but don't know enough about. You exposed a bit of it in the book.
Yeah, I mean, she invited all kinds of people to contribute to this commentary on the Bible where women are either talked about or she says they're made prominent by exclusion, like where the heck are they, why aren't they mentioned? It's generally negative about the Bible. She says a few nice things. She likes Mary, the mother of Jesus, but that's about it. And she got turned down. For example, Frances Willard, who was the head of the Temperance Society, said, well, I really support your project. She was a feminist, but no. I think it was considered too radical by some people, and actually the National Women's Suffrage Association condemned this woman's Bible, because I think they thought it would hurt them. It was too much popular, it was too negative about the Bible. So a lot of it was done by Stanton herself, although she does have other contributors.
She did not know Hebrew or Greek. It was all from the English Bible.
She definitely knew Greek. I don't know about Hebrew. She definitely knew Greek because when she was in high school, she won a prize for Greek, and she came home with the Greek New Testament, told her father, waving it, and he said, "It's a pity you weren't a boy."
Wow.
I think it all started then. But anyway, so she definitely knew Greek.
Most of our Rutgers students arrive on campus from high school Greek. They all know.
Send them to grad school.
But I should read the quote from the book here. This is Claudia speaking. The woman's Bible earned notoriety as a work of Satan, often from people who had not read it. Some women said they needed no special Bible as the current one, meaning the King James obviously suited them fine. And then in the next sentence, talk about the anti-Semitism that is inherent in the book that you mentioned. I don't know if you fleshed that out enough to say something about that.
Well,
Subconscious, conscious, subconscious.
oh, I think some of it's, I mean, say they were anti-Semitic, but some of it was conscious, and some of it was from the contributors, not from her. But for example, they wanted to explain away the second creation story, where the so-called curse of Eve and her husband shall rule over her. And they knew source criticism. They seemed to know that there were different sources or different voices in the Bible. And so I think Stanton said that second part about the curse of Eve, that was some wily husband, some wily Jew, Ellen Dietrich said, who just wanted to invent a way to make his wife obey him. So they kind of they used source criticism to say those Jews. And then there was one of the writers, what doesn't matter, quotes to this, and she said, those Jews, they say a prayer that God, thanking God, and not meaning a Gentile, an idiot, or a woman. Now, idiot is wrong, that's not part of it, she just made that up. And I'm completing the work of Israelite history, basically showing how it's been all about the subjection of women. So there was an attitude that the Hebrew Bible, and then I think by extension, Judaism was very primitive. And so it was sort of made to bear responsibility for the oppression of women. That's all coming from those ancient and less developed people. And well, we don't need to get.
Did you see the New Testament accordingly as the breath of fresh air in that way? Not that she was reading Paul.
Not as much, and the New Testament part isn't as good. Yeah, but they're a little gentler with that. That's true. And she thinks, well, the one good thing is that Mary's in there, and she has some interesting ideas, like talk about God as father, mother, and things like that. I would say one thing. She did defend her friend Ernestine Rose, who was a Polish rabbi's daughter, who was in the women's movement in the 19th century, because she was subject to anti-Semitic attacks in the Hartford newspaper. And so she was defended by Stanton. Stanton pretty much didn't have much use for religion in general.
I gathered that.
Yeah.
Even though she created a woman's Bible.
Yeah, well, yeah.
I'm going to move to the next chapter, for which I just want to show you a few images. Because this was 100% new to me, don't get busy here. So in the middle of the 19th century, these two British scholars, Lees and Burns, created a temperance Bible commentary. We're now moving on to the next chapter. And they apparently, you can see it was originally published in London, 1868, 2 years later, New York, 1870. And remarkably, I know you can't read this, it's too small, but they go through the entire Bible, showing you biblical passages wherever wine, vine, vineyard, grapes, all these words, and they're actually, I'll show you one close up where you actually can read Numbers chapter 28, where they're actually quoting Hebrew words. They're in transliteration, but if you know Hebrew, you'll see the word nesech and shechar, they got it a little bit wrong. And yayin is in there as well, basic Hebrew word for wine. I was fascinated by this. Again, I thought that I sort of knew somewhat about the history of the Bible, and this is remarkable. And to what extent did this book? And their conclusion is that these words actually do not refer to wine, right? Okay, about which I'll say something. Am I correct about that? That was their
Oh,
whole
yeah, it's
bit.
great.
Pardon?
If Jesus drank it, it was grape juice.
It was great. Okay, right. So, I'll give you another piece of Jerseyana in a moment on the grape juice, but let's talk about this project.
Well, I found the Temperance chapter a lot of fun, because you see the extent to which they went to interpret the Bible to show that alcohol was bad. Some of it was really very far-fetched. I mean, you're right, they did engage in philology, the study of words.
I'm sorry, I apologize for the interruptions, Claudia, but in the introduction, because I'm a philologist, in the introduction, Claudia refers to philology as the most niggling scrutiny of individual words. I do that for a living. Now I'm making myself definition. Go ahead.
So sometimes anything that was bad was from alcohol. So Isaac is blind at the end of his life. What was the blindness from? Oh, it was from alcohol. Or Jacob and Esau was overcome by appetites. You see the kind of thing that gets you in trouble with too much wine. So Joshua pledged obedience to the Lord. Well, you see that means he took on temperance pledge. So just anything that was there was brought over to the side of temperance. But what's interesting is that they were anti-literalist. They thought literalism was, well, they said, well, that's the kind of Pharisees do. So here you have this really fairly conservative Protestant group. I mean, all kinds of people were temperance people, but I think it was largely Protestant. Fairly conservative, and yet they were opposed to literal interpretation of the text. So I thought that was interesting, that they were in some ways kind of on board with what was going on in critical scholarship in Europe at the time, because it was useful to them.
I didn't mention they were both Baptist ministers in England, correct?
Oh, okay. I don't know.
I think so, but
Yeah.
maybe I looked that up on my own. For those of you who don't know the story, and I have to interject this, I learned this some years ago. Wine in the Bible has to be wine. And the reason for that is that grapes ferment immediately. They just begin to ferment immediately. And you know when grape juice was invented? Only in the 19th century, when Thomas Welch, a New Jersey dentist and Methodist minister, figured out a way to get the liquid of the pressed grapes into a canning process to prevent my colleague, Rick LaDouche, is in food science, so he's clapping. You teach us at SEDS, I hope so. And that's when grape juice actually started. It took a New Jersey Methodist minister, part of the temperance movement. How many of you know about Ocean Grove, New Jersey? Yeah. A 1 square mile town just south of Asbury Park, bordering Asbury Park, which was founded in the 19th century as a Methodist temperance town. It remains a dry town today. I believe cars were not permitted on Sundays. And it's part of the Methodist revivalism. So this is all part of that great 19th century New Jersey history. And where did Thomas Welch go and settle? He created the new town of Vineland, South Jersey, which later on will become famous as the Jewish chicken farming center, but in the 19th century was That's how Vineland got its name, is where he set up shop to, and of course, Welch's Grape Juice is still probably the #1 brand. It's just a fascinating little bit. So the next edition, you have to do a little more New Jersey work.
Douglas,
There's an overlap between the movements, yes.
oh yeah, and with King Stins, with Anthony, I Wells, they were all different people. It was the great moral movement of the 19th century, which is why I put it in the book, not because I promoted it.
Now, to broaden the horizons here, the 19th century American religious traditions, especially amongst the Protestants, is known as the Great Awakening in American history. And all manner of American religious movements, the most famous of being the Church of Latter-day Saints, but also this Methodist revivalism, Unitarianism, I mean, all the entire banner of 19th century movements fall under this banner of the Great Awakening. So how much of this is tied up with what we look back on and call the Great Awakening?
Well, I think the great insight of the Great Awakening is that you can read the Bible for yourself. I mean, it was very much about individual experience of the Spirit, so that you didn't necessarily need a scholar, you didn't need clergy, you didn't need a church tradition to tell you what the Bible meant. You could read it for yourself. So I think in that sense, that sort of helped people feel that they had access, and also it was a great, it was a moral movement. It was also about moral reform of society. So I think it fits in very nicely with that. The other interesting thing about the Great Awakening is it made space for women to participate and even, basically be preachers. They get a lot of small towns, especially in the West, didn't have clergy. They might even have a church, but they didn't have a clergy person. So they had these circuit riders, especially the Methodists, who would ride around the country and come to a town and preach and have this meeting and do services, I guess, and then move on. And some of those were women. There were women circuit riders doing that. So, and there were even women in the Methodist Church who were given licenses to preach in the 19th century. So they were later withdrawn in the 20th. So I guess in general, I think it created space to feel like people feel like they could understand the Bible themselves, and they could participate in this great moral movement of reform.
And a very Protestant idea, for those of you that are not aware, much more so than the Catholic ideas of Scripture. So I'll finish up with 2 more little points, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So moving into the 20th century, many of us in the room remember the civil rights movement from our youth. Martin Luther King, of course, playing a prominent role. And this quote from King and Hamer, who Claudia was quoting earlier, this struck me. They call 11 o'clock on Sunday morning when people are in church. It's the most segregated hour in the week. And of course, Claudia's referring to they, and now Claudia giving her voice, referring to the fact that most churches in America were segregated. America was segregated, but the churches were segregated in 1967 and so on. I found that so sad to read. Have we progressed beyond that observation 60 years later?
I think so. I hope so. I'm thinking especially of the Southern Baptist Convention. And the Southern Baptist Church originally was pro-slavery and pro-segregation. And I know they have looked into their past, looked into their documents. They repented of that officially. Some people felt that they didn't go far enough. I know that the head of the Southern Baptist Convention, not the current one, but a few years ago, was an African-American man. So at least for that church, I think there's an attempt to make things better.
Can we hope that continue to improve?
Well, I mean, you don't have people going to church as much in general anymore. So
Although the
that's
New York
another
Times had
question.
an article this last week about the increase in church attendance now, Catholic church, and just the last question here, because we are the Build Incentive Study of Jewish Life. The the one major Jewish figure who appears in the book in the last chapter on civil rights, not surprisingly, is Abraham Joshua Heschel. But I want to go back to that 19th century and the abolitionist movement, and just ask you about, for example, a leading figure in American Jewry in the 19th century, Isaac Mayer Wise, the one who reigned with the founder of Reform Judaism in America. That's correct. Seems to have been on both sides and controversial. And what can you tell me about Wise? It's just one of the most public Jewish figures in 19th century. If we can all say that.
Yeah, I don't know, I mean, Jews, I think we're on both sides of that issue, as they usually are. I know, and, you know, I was gonna say, you know, some people complain that the abolitionists were kind of anti-Jewish, a lot of them were evangelicals, and, you know, stereotypic ideas of Jews, and that becomes, I think, kind of a reason or an excuse as to why many Jews weren't more involved in abolitionism. But of course, if I had wanted to, I would put in Rabbi David Einhorn. If I paid attention to the denominational issue, Rabbi David Einhorn was a rabbi from Germany. He was a disciple of Geiger, and he was very strongly anti-slavery and preached about it from the pulpit in Maryland. So Maryland was a slave state, and he put himself in some danger. I think Schwab's went after him. I know his printing press was destroyed. So, so there were Jews, I think, on both sides of the issue. I'll tell you, when I did this book, I didn't pay attention to denominations. I just picked people I thought were interesting, thought were important. People who had an organic relationship with the Bible, who didn't just quote it generally, but really involve themselves. And lo and behold, they were all Protestants. And I think that really speaks to the dominance of Protestant Christianity, even in our history. But it could have been a different book. I could have been very careful and had, you know, some of each. And I did do that in the last chapter. I had Jews, Catholics, and Protestant movements today.
Well, I just want to commend the book. It's a relatively thin volume, packed with so much incredible material. And I just want to commend the book to you. Just thank you, Claudia, for
So I'm going to moderate the questions and let our speakers stay seated. So we have Mike, but Robin's going to bring it up before she does a couple of other New Jersey things. So not only Lucy Stone, but the Elizabeth Cady Stanton papers are edited here by our colleague. So that's another Rutgers connection. And I'm very glad you mentioned David Einhorn. David Einhorn was a really was an abolitionist figure. He got chased out of the synagogue. And he also debates Orthodox Rabbi Morris Raphael about who uses the Bible to justify slavery. So I think it's always important, and you mentioned it, Jews fall everywhere. And the regional history makes a difference. Adam Mendelsohn, a colleague of mine, is writing a book on Jews in the Confederate Army now, having written a book on Jews in the Union Army. I mean, Jews end up adapting to where they live sociologically, politically, and otherwise. And Maryland is such an interesting state. This was a slave state, it was also a border state, so you get some freed blacks who end up living in Maryland. And Einhorn was very, very courageous. I mean, he really had to hightail it out of this, and the mob did go after him. So thank you very much, both of you. So questions to our speakers. There's a coming up.
Yeah, sure.
And again, I know I just commented, but try to ask the question.
Good evening. The title of the book really stimulated me quite, and that's the reason why I'm here. I find it rather interesting that you call it the Progressives Bible. I'd like to know why that. And also, with that in mind, how do we then bring the Bible to, instead of what built America, but how it can serve today in building America, just America. So with progressives, if you can just go into that, because it has to me a negative terminology, that progressives is something new, whereas the Bible is then something old.
Great question.
Yeah, I think for me, the word progressive has replaced liberal. Liberal is a dirty word out there, so that was really what it was. I mean, people who I guess I identify with, who I think are on the right side of history. And it's not necessarily the progressive era, that was confusing, I said that, but no, we're not just talking about that, we're talking basically about people who wanted to change, and wanted to reform society, as opposed to preserving something. Remind me of your second part of your question.
Based on that, how do we keep the Bible into something that we can use from the past? So it is something that's current, not something that's past.
I mean, that's a really good point, because I think some people read this as advocacy on my part, that everybody should go out there and wave their Bibles and support their point. I think that's fine if you can do that naturally, like Senator Raphael Warnock does that very well. I mean, he's a preacher, and you can use on the news hour, he gives a sermon. But mostly, I guess I was trying to kind of open up the picture and say, look, it wasn't always used by conservatives. It doesn't belong to anyone. It's not that the Bible doesn't speak with one voice. It can be used and interpreted by anyone. Yeah, let me just say that. I have other things to say about it.
But also, can I just say the title, I mean, the book came out and you conceived of the title of the contract. The word progressive there's been a way it's been used now today, which many people find, I think I'm speaking on your behalf, so sorry if I'm wrong, but seems not very open and liberal, but rather intolerant and rigid and binary and hostile. So I think that's true. When I first heard Professor Setzer speak about it last year, but I thought, why did you call it the Progressive Bible? Because I think a lot of people will misread the title and not understand what the book is about.
I guess the question is, I want to say it's not the conservative Bible, it's the other side, and
No, but it's also not the left's Bible.
Yeah, right, exactly.
That's what I think.
So it's a puzzle. I don't know.
Great question, great problem,
Yeah.
A philology problem. We wanted to make Dr. Rendsburg happy. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much for this. I'm William Field in the Political Science Department. I'm teaching religion and politics this fall, and I think my students read most of your books, so thank you very, very much. I have a comment and a question. Lucy Stone was president of the New Jersey Women's Suffrage Association for a while. That's why we have her here. But my question is, the gay rights movement has tried to use the Bible, which is very much a progressive interpretation. They haven't had much success doing it, probably because there's been so much withdrawal from the church, from the so-called progressive side. And I'm wondering, adding on to the previous question, how much we really can use the Bible in a transformative way toward the future, when so many of us who are in that space have walked away and thought that it's not worth listening to.
Yeah, and there were a lot of groups I left out, human trafficking, gay rights, etc. I didn't find too much from the gay rights movement. And as I said, that last chapter was a puzzle trying to get it all. But I think one of the things, and this is one of my points of why I use the Bible, is I think it staves off despair to realize that there were other movements that probably in their time seemed impossible. I mean, think of people confronting slavery. You can imagine what the other side said. They said, well, slavery's been around since time began. It has economic implications, it's cultural. You can't get rid of that. They said, well, wait a minute. There was this tongue-tied prophet who led Israel out of Egypt. There was the followers of Jesus who survived the trauma of their founder's death, who ultimately triumphed over Rome, the hostility of the Roman Empire. And so in that sense, it shows you, I think people link themselves and hitch themselves to a broader view of history through using the Bible. So in that sense, I think that it's personally very comforting, that last statement of Douglas, that he didn't despair, in spite of what he saw around him, that he thought God was working in the world. He had faith in American institutions and the genius of America. That to me is useful for any of us, especially as we get discouraged about the state of the world. I'll just stop there. I can give a whole sermon.
If I could just interject and read this beautiful sentence from Claudia's introduction, which I think just speaks to what you were just saying, but I think this was the most beautiful passage in the book. It's in the Roman numeral pages before you get to page 1. Fusing their own experiences with the unfolding of the biblical drama allowed reformers to hitch themselves to a grander, more dramatic narrative in which God sided with the forces of justice and the righteous would triumph. That's really what the book is about, right? These movements who were really hitching themselves to the grand narrative of the Bible. And I need to find a place to use that in my curriculum. I'm not teaching American religion, but this is just such a beautifully written sentence which encapsulates what the book's about.
Okay, we have time, go ahead, sure.
Where was organized religion when this was taking place, the abolitionist movement? The people, especially down south, religious, they would go to mostly church on Sunday. They would have the preacher up there. Same thing can be said for the Jewish population. And yet there's very, to my knowledge, very little written or very little said about the whole concept of slavery during this time period.
During which time period? I'm not sure I'm understanding.
During the American slavery, up until the Civil War.
Were the preachers blind to the fact that they were reading the Bible, they had slaves, and did they address it? Did the majority just were silent, did they defend it?
Well, there was.
I think that's the question.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Some defended it and some were blind to it. Some thought it was okay. There was a guy in the South named Stringfellow who wrote this whole biblical defense of slavery. He used the golden rule. It was just bizarre. And then some of them were abolitionist preachers, like the guy, there was a guy named Albert Barnes, and he was this one who said that slavery wouldn't last an hour outside the church if it were not sustained within the church. So he was also, like Douglas, really critical of the church. Yeah, I think they did. Although, to move ahead to the civil rights movement, you sometimes had people complain, African-American women, I think, have complained that preachers would withdraw and they would say, I'm concerned with spiritual matters. I'm not concerned with politics. And of course, that King criticizes that attitude too. So you probably have people who said, well, I'm concerned with the next world, not this world. But no, I think many defended it, and someone against it. Theodore Dwight Weldon was a preacher or minister. Theodore Parker in Boston was an anti-slavery minister. He certainly wrote a lot about it. But sure.
So before I thank you, I'm going to give you one more anecdote, New Jersey anecdote, this seems to be, but before Martin Luther King Jr. spoke in '63, the person who spoke right before him was Joachim Prinz from Newark, who was a refugee from Germany. So it's not only Heschel gets all the credit, but Prinz was right out there, and his speech is extraordinary. He said the real problem is not criticizing, it's all those of you who are silent. That's what he said. It's silence that allows this kind of terror to reign. He said, I experienced it in Germany, and that's the problem here. And you can see him, if you YouTube it, you can see his speech, and he's right before King, and it's very, very important.
I saw at the Rutgers Jewish Film Festival, the movie.
Yeah, there's yes, Prince, right, we showed it, yes, I know.
Yeah, I was there. So following up with his question and other questions, isn't it possible for the church to be very honest when they preach about the Bible and the golden rule and still believe in slavery, because the slaves are subhuman? So they're in a different category. So they don't deserve, it seems that it's not so far-fetched that they go home after church and they're perfectly fine. What they're doing, there's no dissonance. And Grinke, when she was a child, said to her mother, you know, you go to church, you hear what the preacher says, but we have a slave in our house. And that was her motivation as a child, and that was her motivation to leave.
Yeah, and you know, the Grimke sisters were abolitionists, but the family back home in South Carolina, they still continue to hold slaves. Douglas said more than once that the worst, both enslavers and overseers, were the religious ones. That when you get sold to a clergyman, that's the worst fate. So yeah, clearly religion did not keep people from mistreating their slaves. Sometimes it gave them somehow a license to be worse. So you're right. I mean, I think you're bringing up what's a really difficult question, which is, what part of it is true? How can people on this side use the Bible and people on the other side use the Bible as well? And the answer is, they're obviously combining their own experience and their own predilections to make it work for them.
So I want to thank Professor Setzer and my colleague, Professor Gary Rendsburg. I want to thank all of you for coming. This is our last program. As I said, soon we will be able to tell you about our lineup for the fall, but have a great, safe night, and please avail yourself on who's the publisher of the book?
Fortress Press.
Fortress Press, there you go. Go on Fortress Press's website. You can buy the book, and it makes great reading, and it's very provocative, thinking about a society that we hope will be more just. Thank you. Good night.
Now it's disappeared. I'm afraid it's crawling up my.
Good.